Hey, what's up, guys? This is Paul reporting for duty. We're going to be looking in redcine-x today, just going over some of the basics of color correction specifically for underwater footage. Now, Red has been developing some new cameras and technologies that are continuing to be better suited for underwater capture. But we're going to actually look at some older images just to show you what's possible with the raw images and what you're able to do just in the free redcine-x software to make it look more better. So let's find an image. Alright, here is a little school of fish ready to be taught. Alright, and I looked at this a while ago, so this is kind of what we're going for. This is what it looked like in the beginning, and you see this at first you might say, whoa, is there something wrong with it? Well, underwater light can play uh, tricks on the eye and tricks on the camera. Our eyes are really good at adapting to our environment most of the time, but the camera, just tries to see it objectively. And so our job in the color correction process or color grading is going to be to try and get it a little bit closer to uh, what the eye would see when we're down there, or what we think that it might look like, or what we aspire to see it become. So there's a lot of options creatively uh, in the color grading process. Uh, Main thing is, try and have a good idea of what it is that you're going for, how you want the image to look, and from there you should be able to uh, make good decisions about which way you want to go with the image. Now, one of the first things that I look at is which color space do I want to be working in. You can play around with these as we go. Whoop. Sometimes it's good to just sort of come back to these and look at them later, but for now we'll use the latest color science. That's a whole discussion. Usually the latest color science is the best, but sometimes for creative or technical reasons you may want to use one of the earlier color sciences, the red color, red gammas. And of course, if you're going to another grading software after this, you may want to think about using the red log uh, function, but for now we'll just focus on what we're going to do in this software. So the Kelvin temperature and your white balance, that's one of the most important decisions you can make before you start grading your image. What you want to do um, is, personally, I think that when you're shooting, or if you're talking to someone that's going to be shooting underwater, I always think it's a good idea, if possible, to use the control that you have to set your white balance by eye when you're making the shot. And that can be on a scene by scene basis or a shot by shot basis. But the idea there is, let the cinematographer or the underwater cameraman or woman or person uh, set it the best that they can in the environment. And that should hopefully give you a good starting point. But let's say you just get one randomly. What you want to do is really just start playing around with these numbers, and you might find that you want to use a number that's outside this default range. Okay? And really, you can spend a long time messing around with these. Now, one thing that you'll see here is that uh, red light sometimes has a difficult time showing up when there's so much blue. And that just has to do with the physics of light underwater. And generally, the deeper that you go, the less red light you're going to see. And for that reason, I actually like tungsten lights underwater. That being said, I'm not an underwater DP, so talk with some of those guys about what lights they recommend. But bringing a light that has some red in it can bring out those reds and yellows and other colors that are naturally deficient in the underwater environment. And we can have an old debate later about whether that's natural or unnatural or what it is. But the point here is you want to get your white balance set. And I'm liking about this 20,000. And then you got to worry about your tint as well. It's actually better to set that first before you see. Now we're going to have to go back and do something different here. That being said, so really what you do, more than with regular images, you do a lot of playing around. To find out what works. And what doesn't. And when you get that awesome number, you just kind of go with it. Alright, now the ISO here, since this is raw, just like the white balance can be fluctuated in post-production, so can your ISO. And so I'm actually going to boost this light up just a little bit. Anytime you boost up your ISO, you're going to increase your noise levels in your shadows. Personally, I don't mind a little bit of noise texture or grain texture if you're used to working with film still. I think most of us are starting to understand digital. This FLEC control just gives you a little extra leeway. You can dial it in. Now personally, I like using nice numbers. It's not exactly necessary, but it makes for good math. This is always a good thing to play around with if you're having trouble with an image. Otherwise, don't worry about that DRX. Now, one thing I usually like to do, unless you're going for a desaturated look, I do like to add some saturation. Now, just note on the saturation, there is a difference between doing the saturation here in the raw processing or doing it later. You can add saturation after the raw processing, just like you can add saturation after you take the image out of redcine-x. Now personally, I don't like using the contrast here. I'd much rather control it with curves, which we'll get into in a second. And so usually all three of these things I don't worry about too much. But if that's your way of getting the image that you like, that's totally fine. You got some other options here. I usually don't mess with those. So let's just get into this curve, and the first thing that I use is the Luma curve, and I generally like to set my shadow level about where I like it, and you can spend a long time playing around with the curves, and it's kind of fun. So the basic idea, if you haven't played with curves before, is that in the upper right hand corner, that controls your highlights, and your shadows are of course on the other end. And underwater stuff is way different than dealing with regular situations where you have skin tones and uh, gamma levels that are real important for visual appeal of maybe a model or something. In this case, we're just going to hope that the fish aren't too image conscious, and we'll just do what looks best for the image here. So I'm actually going to increase the gamma up here quite a bit and add that extra brightness, just because I want this to be a happy school of fish. Now we're not done. What we need to do here, what I think we should do here, is take a look at some of these individual channels, and this way we can add in some colors that for whatever reason are not showing up in the original capture, but they're there. All that stuff is there in the raw data, and so we're going to try and get it out. You'll notice this red channel over here. Like I said, there's a lot of blues and greens in the water, and this being converted to an RGB image, red, green, blue. The red is kind of getting left out over here, and so what we're going to do is we're going to really work on this red and make sure that it is brought out in the image. Okay, and one of the issues we're going to have is that there's going to be a little bit of noise, just because the conditions underwater are really difficult for the red light to thrive. So we're going to see if we can help it out here. So the main thing to do is just sort of see what happens, and you can see as we do this, it's real subtle, but we're starting to get some of that color back that is there. And it's mainly in the shadows here, and as I said, don't worry too much about the noise. In my opinion, color is much more important than worrying about noise. And like I said, a little texture just sort of gives the image just something extra. And you can always do noise reduction, okay? If you're seeing too much noise, you're seeing some splotchiness, sometimes you got to make sure you're doing your white balance. Doing the white balance underwater and things like that can be very difficult, so just do the best you can when you're out there, and otherwise get some recommendations from your DP or an underwater specialist. So color-wise, though, we brought out, we got these little red highlights here, and I'm generally liking where this image is going. Now, as we get into the green and blue here, we got to sort of start getting an idea of what color do you want the water to be. And that's always a difficult question. That's always why we go back to the original, and that's why it's a good idea to set the white balance when you're there. That being said, once you start incorporating those into a longer piece, like maybe a documentary or a short video, you may or may not want the color of the water to remain consistent. And so that's something to think about. You may not want it to be consistent. And so there are sort of creative decisions that have to be made along the process of what do you want the viewer's experience to be? Are you trying to stay true to what the camera sees? Are you trying to stay true to what the cameraman saw? Are you just trying to make a visual pleasing image? Or are you trying to tell a story that uses the subtleties of color in order to create an emotional response that is sometimes unconscious, and always very subtle. So just some things to think about as we're messing around with the color of water. In my opinion, there's a little bit too much green here, and so we're going to dial that down and see what we can get. Now, I don't think we need any more blue in the shadows. We may want a little blue here. Now, it's always good if you've done some snorkeling or some diving, just to get a sense of how things are underwater, and you know how things look and how they appear. Observation is always a good idea. There's a scene in story of Wart, who becomes King Arthur, where he becomes fish and swims around and sees what's going on in the underwater realm. And it's not a bad idea to just sort of get a sense of, you know, what are the creatures doing under there? What are the created things doing? What are they up to? What's their purpose? And if you can start to understand that, you know, I think you can have a good feeling for, you know, how you want to present this school of fish in a way that hopefully they would appreciate. And always thank the fish for letting them be captured, and it's really good if you can ask them permission beforehand. When possible. Now, we've done some cool stuff with the curves up there. This is the lift cam again, these wheels. This is where it's really nice, I assume, to have a control panel. But you can work on it, because these are real subtle adjustments that you make, and you can see real quick you can make drastic changes in the image just by rolling these wheels around. Okay, so the main thing to do here is, if you haven't messed with these before, just sort of mess around with them and see what happens, and just sort of try and massage the image into a place where you like what it looks like. So I like this. It's not exactly what we had. It looks to me pretty natural, and to me it's not too overbearing. The colors are really nice and fairly natural to what I think I would see there. Now we've got a bunch of red splotches and stuff like that. There is stuff that we can do about that while still maintaining the overall integrity of the color in the image. But that will be for more advanced stuff in another lesson. Okay, so this is what we started out with. This is what it looks like now. In my mind, that's an improvement. We'll get into some of the more advanced things later of how to make this image even better, or another image even better. The main thing I wanted you to get here is there's a lot of controls here. Just mess around with them a little bit and get a feel for them, and that way, whether you hire a professional colorist to get your done work for you real quick, or whether you just want to do a little work yourself to push out a still, or if you want to send something to your color artist to say, hey, here's sort of what I'm going for, can you make it even better? Those can be really helpful things just to be able to communicate with your color artist. And keep the process moving along. So thank you all for listening and watching, and hope you have a good day.